Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are joined with Dr. Gregory Sadler to discuss the 11th century philosopher and theologian Anselm of Canterbury. Dr. Sadler is an author, speaker, coach, and consultant who holds an MA and Ph.D. in philosophy from Southern Illinois University Carbondale. He has held a faculty fellowship with Notre Dame's University's Erasmus Institute, studying models of practical reasoning under Alasdair MacIntyre. His scholarly publishing to date includes one book, dozens of book chapters, articles, and encyclopedia entries, and his work spans the history of Western philosophy. And he currently teaches at the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. Dr. Sadler, thank you so much for joining with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And we get to talk about one of my favorite thinkers, somebody who I think I've written the most about in the course of my career, which is Anselm of Canterbury. Somebody who's often passed over, or overlooked, or reduced down to Proslogian too. So this is a great opportunity to evangelize a little bit about why people should read Anselm and not just read a little snippet of him.
Right, exactly. Yeah, typically when it's when you treat Anselm in Philosophy 101 courses, it's like that, that one note card of the ontological arguments and bullet point, and that's all we're going to discuss and just pass over him. But really, from what I've just read of Anselm of Canterbury, the ontological argument, it's really just a part of Anselm's broader understanding of God and the existence of God and the divine attributes.
Well, that's quite true. And you can say that, so there's two things to say right off the bat. So Anselm doesn't have an ontological argument. That's Kant's term that we then appropriated. And like you said, it goes into textbooks and 101 classes. And usually it's like, we're going to knock that out right away. And then we jump to the 5 ways. And then we talk about the argument from design, and we ignore all the other stuff that's going on. So there's that aspect. But what people call the ontological argument, and by that mostly they mean Proslogian chapter 2, sometimes they'll extend it to chapter 3 and 4, isn't actually Anselm's one argument that the Proslogian centers on, the one argument that is supposed to prove that God exists, or rather that God has being, Deus esse, but then also, just as importantly, that God is the supreme good that all other goods need in order to be good, and then everything else that we believe about God, which is kind of quite a junk drawer, packed with a number of different items. And I think that often gets overlooked when people talk about the argument, right? The argument is one that, if you want to call it an ontological argument, the ontological argument is just one little aspect or component of.
Definitely. So if I can ask, if we can maybe situate Anselm of Canterbury within his time, where exactly is Anselm coming from in sort of the history of philosophy in the Middle Ages? I mean, during Anselm's time, were there university systems? Were texts of Aristotle, were they circulating? Where exactly does he fit?
Well, the universities as such are going to rise later, but not that much later, because, for example, you're going to see Abelard later on in the 12th century. And Anselm is a straddler. He's 11th and 12th century. He lives to 1109. And he's quite busy. He's Archbishop of Canterbury, and he's got a lot of monks to worry about and take care of, but he does get a lot of writing done. As a matter of fact, a little bit of trivia: when he dies, he actually has in mind, writing another book about the nature of the soul. And he says, oh, it's too bad, because none of you are going to figure this out, if I don't do it for you. But in any case, yeah, so he's he's before he's at the very cusp of what we often call the High Middle Ages, right? And we associate that not just with, all the cool chivalry stuff, but also with the rise of the universities and this term that gets coined later on, scholasticism. So in Anselm's time, the monasteries are really the biggest game in town. And the Benedictines are pretty much like the premier order. It's shortly before the rise of the Franciscans and Dominicans, and the Benedictines would also include some of these. They're a very large network. So, Bernard de Clairvaux is technically speaking a Benedictine because he's a Cistercian, and the Cistercians are coming out of the Benedictines. And these are some authors, Abelard and Bernard, who are coming a little bit later than Anselm. And prior to Anselm, there's a lot going on. We have we could call it the end of antiquity, with people who we often classify as medievals who wouldn't recognize themselves as medievals, like Augustine, or several generations later, Boethius. The Roman Empire, we're taught, falls to the Germans, but it's really continuing on as kind of an ideology and organization. And then we have the Carolinginian Renaissance, and that's associated, Carolinginian coming from Charlemagne, Charles the Great, and he brings in Alcuin, another Benedictine, to like reform education. And reform, it doesn't just mean like fix it; it means like reconstitute it from the ground up. And so these Benedictines are playing a really important role. And it's the learning is associated primarily with monasteries, which often had their own schools, which were not just for monks, but also for local people, and then cathedrals. So sometimes it would be sort of double duty, like the cathedral at Canterbury, right? So Anselm himself is somebody who chose the monastic life after coming from a noble family. He actually leaves and crosses the Alps on foot with his servant, goes into France, screws around for a couple years. We don't know what he was doing, other than he has this meditation for lost virginity. So he clearly, screwed around a bit. And we don't know the particulars of that, other than it was sinful, according to Anselm. And then he decides he wants to become a monk, and he has to decide, well, which monastery am I going to go for? Do I want to go to Cluny? Do I want to go to this place? And he decides on this weird new monastery, Bec, where Lanfranc is teaching. And Lanfranc is going to go on and become Archbishop of Canterbury. He's an important legal theorist. He does a lot of the background work, you could call it, helping out William the Conqueror after he takes over England. And so there's a lot of moving parts, you could say, going on. And you mentioned Aristotle. Did they have much Aristotle? Yeah, kind of. I mean, they had translations by Boethius of a few Aristotelian texts. If Boethius had he could see the writing on the wall that fewer and fewer people in the West could read Greek. And so he was going to translate all of Plato and all of Aristotle into Latin. And had he succeeded in doing so, we might have a very different intellectual history. But he only translated a few texts and wrote some commentaries. But they had a lot of Aristotle through other authors like Seneca and Cicero and all these people that the monks were copying texts of and reading and studying. So, they didn't have, it's not like, the heyday of the Aristotelian Renaissance associated with the universities and scholasticism, but they did know some things, and they had some Plato as well. And they also had exposure to the Stoics, and they knew vaguely about the Epicureans and skeptics and things like that, in part because these monks were, they were the preservers and transmitters of culture. So Anselm got to read quite a lot. And then there's all these, these other people that are Christian thinkers who he's reading as well. Augustine, Boethius, we mentioned. Gregory the Great was, incredibly important. As a matter of fact, one of the few references we have by Anselm two texts is talking about Gregory's Moralia in Job. In one of his letters, he's like, yeah, we'll send it to you, and you can copy it and then send it back because we need it. So there's a lot of people. I mean, Anselm would have read Alcuin and other thinkers, and so there's like a lot of stuff being transmitted from antiquity through these other authors.
Right. And if I can maybe follow up in that, how exactly would you best characterize the thought of Saint Anselm? Is he best described as Augustinian? Is he Platonic? I mean, one of the bizarre things about Anselm, like you said, that he doesn't cite authorities the way that like Peter Abelard will later on. Authority isn't really as big of a deal for Anselm in his writings. But do we know maybe some of his intellectual antecedents?
Well, it's safe to assume that anybody that was in a decent monastery library would have been read by Anselm at one point or another. So, as I mentioned, the monks preserved Cicero, Seneca, some other, they liked Ovid, for example, his erotic works. They would, and sometimes they'd find ways to sublimate that into sort of like the Song of Songs. It's not really about screwing, it's really about God, but they had a pretty wide range of reading, and of course, all of Augustine's stuff was readily available. Boethius's treatises were widely circulated. I mentioned Alcuin. There were a number of other monastic authors as well. Now, it's interesting with is he an Augustinian? So Etienne Gilson, in one of his books about Christian philosophy from the 30s, he says that you can always tell if somebody is an Augustinian, but you never know what they're going to say next, because there's so many ways of interpreting Augustinian thought, depending on what emphasis you put on it. Maurice Blondel made a similar set of remarks in his article on the ever-renewed fecundity of Augustinian thought. So to label him as an Augustinian doesn't tell you that much, right? Anselm, you could say, well, does he hold traditional Augustinian doctrines? Well, what are those? Divine illumination. I mean, every once in a while he'll say something kind of like that, but it's not like some of the later Augustinians where that seems to be very important. The notion of there being different ways in which we love, and that the will is you could say the instrument of loving and desiring and all of that. Okay, that's pretty Augustinian, but that's also kind of a commonplace throughout other strands of philosophy as well. He could get that from John Cassian, who's a major monastic author, who the rule of Saint Benedict actually tells you should read Cassian, so Anselm has read Cassian inside and out. So is he Augustinian? I mean, he uses Augustine as a cover, so to speak, when he's writing to Lanfranc about the Monologian, but he doesn't use him much for that afterwards. So he's clearly, you could say he's influenced by Augustine. He's read Augustine, but would he have described himself as Augustinian? I don't really know. I mean, there's some gaps in what we have, you could say. And then Platonism. So, Kate Rogers actually has a early book, the Platonic philosophy of St. Anselm, if I can remember it right, which I believe was originally her dissertation at Notre Dame. And she's also written about this in articles, and she makes the point that he's broadly Platonic, but again, well, what is Platonism?
Sure.
Does it mean citing Plato's dialogues? He doesn't do that, but he wouldn't have had a lot of Platonic dialogues. The Timaeus was circulating around, and that's mostly about creation. But thinking that what we could call universals, or at least some of them, can be realities that not only have a being of their own, but might even have a certain sort of agency. That's kind of Platonic, right? And one of the things I do like about Rogers' work, her early work, is that she says you might not buy Anselm's point of view because Platonism is not widely looked to or held in the contemporary philosophical scene, but hey, we're any position you take metaphysically involves some commitments that you really can't justify to everybody. There's no consensus.
Mm.
So if you want to be a Platonist, it's fine to be a Platonist, um, just as fine as being any other thing,
Sure.
that, or it's at least as plausible as the alternatives to it, which I think is a correct position. So going back to the authority thing, though, yeah, he is kind of unusual, right? And it's not just Abelard, but you could think about, I mentioned Alcuin, and you could think about closer monastic writers to Anselm's time. They tend to um, cite authorities, and the authorities will be, scripture,
Mm.
or it will be um, ancient philosophers who they have some bits of, or it'll be some of the other texts that were circulating around, many of which were, you could say, theological, in church fathers and things like that, right? So the question isn't just whether somebody quotes authority, but how do they do it?
Mm.
If you think about, well, let's jump ahead to Thomas Aquinas. When he is citing people, most often he's citing them in the objections or in the sed contra, right?
Right.
It's in the I respond that. He's not usually bringing up authority. He's working things out rationally, dialectically on his own. And quite often he's bringing up authority in order to make an argument that he'll rebut. And he's not
Mm.
rebutting the authority, he's rebutting the misuse of the authority, right?
Right.
And I think you could see other figures doing similar things from time to time. It's very important to be able to decide whether somebody is blindly arguing from authority or whether they're bringing up an authoritative text in order to unpack it, or even, critically assess it, or something like that. Anselm doesn't do that. And I think that, so, I don't have a fully worked out idea on this, and there are some floating around out there by better Anselm scholars than myself. But here's the stab that I'll take at it. Anselm thinks that the human mind was given to us by God, and it's something incredibly complex, incredibly valuable. It has a dignity to it, and we should develop it as much as possible. And so we can do so by using the very resources or the capabilities of the mind, choosing to do so. So the will plays a role, not just the intellect. Um, and by the way, this is a bit of a side note. Sometimes people in medieval philosophy will make a distinction between higher and lower intellectual faculties, like,
Mm.
ratio versus intellectus. Anselm explicitly does not do that. In the as yet untranslated Dicta Anselmi, there's actually a passage where he like mentions a whole bunch of synonyms: mind, spirit, intellect, reason. These are all the same thing, he says. So they're all sort of just, different ways of looking at the same thing. So you don't have a higher and lower faculty sort of thing. You can
Mm.
think about it as like some people's minds are doing, better work than others, and a lot of that has to do with training. And then there's also the aspect of, at every moment there's like a sort of moral reformation and intellectual reformation going on within the human person, aided by grace, which we
Mm.
then take advantage of. So, Anselm, like Augustine, but like so many others, will in his dialogue say, hey, let's try to do this investigation. Hopefully God will help us out. We'll make some progress on this. That's a typical Anselmian move. So it's understood that we're trying to get our minds to operate, as we say, on all cylinders, right? Using this car metaphor. But there's also like God helping us out if we're open to grace, and we take the stuff that we've got, which does include, say, scripture, and then we try to make sense out of it. We don't just rest content with saying, well, Bible says XYZ.
Mm.
We want to think about, well, what the hell does that actually mean? So Anselm, I mean, could he have brought in authorities as sort of like interlocutors? Probably, but I don't think he saw a need for it. The other thing that's important to remember too is that a lot of times Anselm doesn't write a work because he needs it for his, later on university teaching, or because, like Abelard, he wants to show off, or because he's trying to put together some sort of systematic philosophy. He's writing because people bug the crap out of him until he does it, or because he sees some sort of helpful opportunity. So like the Monologian, we know from the preface that he was teaching these monks as the prior at the monastery at Bec, and they were like, wow, you got some really good stuff, man. Can you like write this stuff down for us? And he's like, nah, I don't think I will. And then they're like, come on, and then so finally it's like, fine, here you go. Here's the Monologian. The Proslogian has got a whole different origin story, but then like the next treatises are basically like teaching texts. The monks need these to make sense out of scripture, and so we get that trilogy of On Truth, On Freedom of Choice, and The Fall of the Devil, and then the On the Grammarian as well. And then then we get stuff like where he's actually like responding to problems within, or controversies within the church, like on the incarnation of the Word and on the procession of the Holy Spirit. And he's got some other ones like Cur Deus Homo and De Conceptu, and where he's he's responding to problems that are being felt by people. And then he also has a ton of letters, which are very good to look at, because oftentimes he's not just like saying, hey, you got to watch out for that priest, don't let him into town because he gets drunk and starts chasing women. You got to rein him in, dealing with the kind of bureaucratic stuff that you do. But he'll explain things to people. And then he also has these prayers and meditations. And Anselm, a lot of people don't realize this, Anselm made just as big of an impact in transforming how people prayed as he did in thinking about, how should we argue towards God or something like that. These prayers circulated around, and he was considered to be such a interesting innovator that other people imitated him and attributed prayers that they wrote to Anselm. So by the time that Schmidt and Southern are going through and trying to figure out which prayers are actually genuine, and I think they came up with like 13 or 14. There were like 100 attributed to Anselm. So he's willing to interweave biblical stuff, things coming from scripture, but he never does so in an uncritical way. He's always trying to unpack what's actually going on, and that's it's actually not that big of an innovation. You look at scripture commentaries from the early fathers onward, they're not just slavishly following the text. They're trying to, they have this faith that the text is actually very rich and rewards those who put in the work to try to figure out, what's going on. And then you and me, well, I'll speak for myself, not for you, who are a bit more lazy than them, we can sort of benefit by reading, well, these things that smart, hardworking people manage to pull out of the text. I'm glad that they did the work, because I know I couldn't have done it myself. So same thing with Anselm,
Yeah, that all makes sense. If I can maybe shift the conversation a little bit to discussing maybe Anselm's works, and I wanted to maybe focus particularly on the Monologian, as you said, and the Proslogian.
Yeah.
If we start with Monologian, when was that written in Anselm's career, and what exactly is the contents of the treatise? I know you said that it's kind of the result of his fellow monks hackling him to write it, but what's he trying to do in the treatise?
It's his first main work, right? And it's one that in some respects, the fact that he actually does send it off to Lanfranc looking for some sort of approval, which he doesn't really get, and needs to at least have a little bit of hiding under, Augustine's cloak. Um, it shows maybe a little, I don't want to say a lack of confidence, but he's sort of like testing the waters, right? And he's a prior at the monastery when he writes that, and actually quite a few of the early works, so that the Proslogian, those theological treatises, those are all written while he's a prior. And the prior is sort of like a second in command at the monastery. You have the abbot, and an abbot's like a bishop, they have like the power of a bishop within their monastery. And then, a lot of the day-to-day stuff gets delegated to this prior who's also in charge of teaching, at least at Beck. So yeah, it's while he's in his first leadership role, you could say, because he's eventually going to become abbot, right? He gets voted in. This is a little bit of a side note, right? So history is full of these interesting people who are very capable intellectually, but also capable practically. And there's probably a connection between those, right?
Mm.
So I'd mentioned Gregory the Great, who was one of the popes during a time when Rome is falling apart. Gregory was just a Benedictine monk who wanted to be left alone to do his prayers and stuff like that, but he was a capable administrator. So they made the poor guy pope, and he never really had, peace after that. And the same thing's going to happen to Anselm, right? He doesn't want to be prior, but he gets made prior, and then he doesn't want to be abbot. And one of the bishops, actually, one of the local bishops says, I'm, telling you, and this is my command to you, that if anybody offers you any higher position, you're to take it, right? Because, he will soon be offered Archbishopric of Canterbury by Henry's son, who thinks that Anselm is going to be a nice pushover, like essentially Lanfranc was, and it turns out not to be the case at all. So this is being written, and you could say actually that his life gets more and more complicated as he moves up, right? So the Monologian is written at a almost idyllic time before he had so many responsibilities, right? And yeah, what is the purpose? It's to to communicate the stuff that we could look at the prologue here, right? So he says, some of the brethren have often eagerly entreated me to write down some of the things I told them in our discussions about how one ought to meditate on the divine essence, and about certain other things related to such a meditation, and a sort of pattern for meditating on these things. So that tells you right off the bat, he's not writing, I'm going to provide you with a whole bunch of arguments, and those arguments will, indubitably convince you of blah, blah. He's not doing that sort of thing. This is a way of thinking our way towards God, or approaching God, and not just with our mind, but our heart as well. And so he says, having more regard to their own wishes than the ease of the task, they prescribed the following form for me in writing the meditation. Nothing in it would be established by scripture. Rather, whatever the conclusion of each individual investigation might assert the necessity of reason would concisely prove, and the clarity of truth would manifestly show that this is the case by means of a plain style, unsophisticated arguments, and straightforward disputation. They also insisted I should not disdain to answer even simple and almost foolish objections that might occur to me. So, he's got a mandate. Does he follow it completely? Not entirely, but pretty close. And, he says, this is in the role of someone who by thought alone disputes and investigates within himself things he'd not previously realized. So the Monologian, I'm talking to myself, right? The Proslogian, in Greek, in relation to talking to God. And the Proslogian is, if you look at the structure of it, it's actually it's meditation, but it's also prayer.
Mm.
So coming back to the Monologian, right? It's a much longer piece. There's there's a number of chapters, and they're ranging over a whole bunch of things. There are some arguments for the being, the esse of a supreme being. And then there's all these other things that you could say matter just as much. Like when we talk about the divine attributes, right? Well, what is God? How can we say things about God and have them actually make sense or mean something that we can wrap our heads around? So there's a lot of discussion there. There's a number of developments in this sort of Trinitarian path, working through it kind of laboriously. As a matter of fact, you could say that the bulk of the work is actually trying to make sense out of the traditional notion of the Trinity, but now in terms of what Father, Son, and Holy Spirit would be. And then there's all these, implications for us schmucks, us, human beings who definitely are not the Trinity, but have something kind of like that within ourselves. And, there's a couple, you could call them places where he's going off slightly on another path, talking about like different ways in which we speak things, different types of words, or different levels of things being truthful. He actually has something that comes up in the Monologian that I think is pretty trippy, is the notion that you and I exist more truly in the divine being or in the divine mind than we do in reality, in ourselves, in say. Right? So there's a better me in God's mind that I am kind of a crappy copy of, and crappy because I've made myself crappy. I mean, we'll talk at a different point about the will and how we damage ourselves, but there is some sort of model of how I ought to be, that is more real than me, right? So, I mean, this is going way beyond just like arguments for God's existence. This is some pretty interesting theology there.
Right.
So that's a Monologian, and then the Proslogian, he sets for himself this task of trying to take the interwoven, whatever we want to call it, nexus, contextum in Latin, of multiple arguments. An argument doesn't mean what we typically take it to mean today. It's more like multiple lines of reasoning. And you want to see if we can work it all into unum argumentum that's going to prove all of these things. One single argument, which is almost all of the Proslogian. Right. I would say that every one of the chapters, except for the last three, which he labels as conjectures, are the single argument.
Right. As I understand it, the Proslogian was written more so as like a follow-up to the Monologian. It was sort of like a condensed version
of.
Well,
it's not a condensed version of it. That's the thing. It is a separate work which is doing some of the same jobs, although not all of them. Not everything that's in the Monologian makes it into the Proslogian. And it's offering a different path, you could say. I mean, one of the ways in which you can see this quite clearly is in Anselm's his responses to Gaunilo's objections, right? So Gaunilo is a good guy for being clever but missing the point on a lot of stuff. And Gaunilo changes Anselm's language from that than which nothing greater can be conceived or thought, right? Quo maius cogitari non posset, to the greatest being. And that's the language that Anselm is using in the Monologian, the supreme being, right?
Right.
Summa, right? And Anselm says, hey, I'm not saying that here. And you can't actually argue the same way from quo maius cogitari non posset as you can from summum ens or whatever else you want to have. And Gaunilo doesn't quite get that, right? He thinks that these are essentially equivalent, as do many interpreters of Anselm later on, when they're like, think of like the logically perfect being or any of these other locutions that they use, unless it's quo maius cogitari non posset, or sometimes Anselm will also say valeat instead of posset. You're not actually addressing Anselm, you're addressing somebody else who you're calling Anselm.
Right.
So the Proslogian is you could say it's kind of an advance over the Monologian. And there's also an aesthetic motif to it. Anselm, I mean, I won't go through the whole story about like, oh, he tried to figure this out, then the devil, he's worried that he's not making progress. The devil's making him waste his time from his monkish activities. So I'm going to stop thinking about this. And then, it becomes more and more of a problem for him. And then suddenly has this breakthrough, this kind of epiphany while he's saying morning prayers, and he sees it, right? And what did he see? Some Anselm scholars think it's the formula quo maius cogitari non possit. Others say maybe it's the whole of the Proslogian. So he goes and he writes it down on these wax tablets, because that's how you would do your first drafts. And he tells us that the reason why he's actually providing this is because he himself took joy in it. And he wanted to be able to share that joy with others. So he says, judging then what had given me such joy, gaudeam, rather, to discover would afford pleasure if written down to anyone who might read it. I've written this tract down, right? So he's not writing it to like convince us all by some sort of rigid iron cage of rationality that we must believe in God. He's offering it to us as a way of meditating upon what God would be and what our connection to God would be. So yeah, I mean, which makes sense. I mean, you got fellow monks and they can have crises of faith, right?
Right.
You read the monastic literature, there's a lot of stuff that people get up to in the monasteries.
Yes.
Right. It's not, people talk about the age of faith, right? And the age of faith, it's not like everybody believed, or
Right.
even if they did believe, like they believed 100% and practiced it.
But
right. So the Proslogian is it's interesting. You can use it as a devotional tool, which I used to do years and years ago. As a matter of fact, Paul Griffiths, at one point, he remarked to me, he's a big Augustinian scholar, you're probably the only person in the present who's actually praying the Proslogian as a devotional. And then I was like, yeah, but what about Eileen Sweeney? She's actually got writings on this sort of stuff, So he's like, yeah, okay. So there's a few of you out there doing that.
Nice.
I think that's what Anselm intended for his Proslogian.
Right. It's almost like a prayer rather than like a syllogistic argument for Anselm.
Yeah, you're not going to find syllogisms in Anselm, and frankly, syllogisms are overrated. When Thomas Aquinas tries to arrange things in syllogistic form, that's usually when he's doing his worst work. I mean, you see him like in his commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, just trying to force all these things into syllogistic structures. And you're like, you don't need to do that. It's interesting, too, because syllogism in its original sense doesn't just mean like this two premise, one conclusion kind of thing. It means to, put together some sort of coherent reasoning. Aristotle uses the term in much broader senses in the Rhetoric and the Nicomachean Ethics and in other places like that. Anger syllogizes, he says in book 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics. So, syllogism is a little bit of an overrated term, you could say.
So if I can then maybe ask, how exactly does Anselm in the Proslogian sort of try to argue that God has being? How exactly does he go off that? I know we talked about how the maxim that he uses is quo nihil maius cogitar non potest. That's sort of the foundation, or not the foundation, but the starting point for Anselm.
That's right. Yeah. So that formula, quo maius cogitari non possit, that than which nothing greater can be thought, with a few variations, as I mentioned in language. That is really the key, not just to proving that God has being or exists, but everything else that we traditionally think about God. So
Mm.
is it, we'll look at that argument, but I do want to bring up chapter 5, right?
Sure.
So in chapter 5, we have this super important transition where he says, well, what are you, Lord God? You then, whom nothing greater can be thought. What are you save that supreme being existing through yourself alone, who made everything else from nothing? So that's like hearkening back to the Monologian stuff, right? Those are things that he's arguing in the first, 7 chapters of the Monologian. And then he says, whatever is not this is less than that which can be thought of, but this cannot be thought about you. What goodness then could be wanting to the supreme good through which every good exists? Thus, you are just, truthful, happy, and whatever it is better to be than not to be. So these are divine attributes, right? And, I do want to actually point out one other thing too. Being is an attribute. It is
Mm.
not the total. It's not as if first you prove God's being and then you pin a whole bunch of attributes to it.
Right.
God is just as well called goodness as being, as justice, as, and then we get to the weirder ones, life,
Mm.
eternity, unity, which later he'll talk about as simplicity. God just is whatever it is better to be than not to be. And Anselm is deriving this from that quo maius cogitari non possit. So all of these things are just as important as the being of
Right.
God. Interestingly, too, I will point this out, and I haven't yet completely wrapped my head around it. We often will construe the arguments as like proving that God exists, right?
Mm.
Rather than God has being. Anselm actually does use the term existit
Mm.
in the argument in Proslogian 2. And what exactly is existere as opposed to esse? Well, it adds something, but saying exactly what that something is, that's a little tricky. I'm working on a piece that goes through all of Anselm's corpus that we have and looking at all the instances where he uses existens or existit or stuff like that. But it's important if we go back to the Monologian, when Anselm is saying what God is. God is, he uses the example of justice, and God can be said to be justice or to be just. And he says, God is justitia existens. God
Mm.
is like justice that is the most justice,
Right.
you know? So there's something interesting going on there in the language. But going back to like Proslogian chapter 2, right? So the argument there is not that complicated, but it is tricky. You could
Right.
say, right? We can make a distinction there. So he says, okay, we got this biblical fool. The fool says in his heart, God does not exist, right? And this is in the Psalms, and I mean it's kind of an interesting point that non-belief or belief that God is just a figment of the imagination. It goes back to biblical times.
Mm.
Again, it's not like everybody who heard about God automatically were like, oh yeah, I know that guy exists. I better watch out for him. The fool is actually the person who not only says God doesn't exist, but because God doesn't exist, I'm going to do whatever the hell I want, including oppressing the poor and
Mm.
being unjust and taking bribes and stuff like that. So the fool, Anselm doesn't worry about that quite so much. He's like, okay, the fool says God doesn't exist, and then he's making a move here that there are some legitimate objections to. He says, can it be that a thing of such nature does not exist, right? Surely when the same fool hears what I am speaking about, namely something than which nothing greater can be thought, or that than which nothing greater can be thought, aliquid quo maius cogitari non possit. He has that in his understanding, in his mind, right?
Mm.
Now, why the hell should the fool look at God that way?
Mm.
Why, Anselm is bringing it up. And now it's interesting because once you actually do introduce this one formula, as opposed to a perfect being or the supreme being or the highest degree of being, or pick whatever else you might want to bring
Mm.
in, you're kind of stuck. So the
Right.
fool doesn't have to hear this, right? The fool could have heard all sorts of nonsense about God. Oh, God is like this big bearded guy in the sky who,
Right.
if you're bad, is, he's like looking at you all the time. So, don't do anything naughty. That
Right.
could be our conception of God. But if we change the conception of God to this one formula, then the rest of the stuff starts to slide into place. So we can distinguish between two ways of being. And this is where some other people might say, no, this is illegitimate, right? And that's, that's a possible objection to it. But Anselm says that, listen, people, at least in my day and culture, are going to accept that there's existence in the mind, right? Or being in the mind, rather,
Mm.
the object of a thought, and existing in reality, in re.
Okay.
So, once we have that, we can start like putting the rest of the pieces into place. And so he's going to say it's greater to exist in reality than to exist just in the mind. And here's where we could actually stop and say, well, wait a second. I can think of a, super poisonous spider, and it's better for that not to exist in reality, right? I don't want to
Sure.
get bit by that. Or I don't know, pick whatever else you want. A very painful ointment that somebody could smear on your face, and now your face is burning or something like that,
Mm.
right? We can imagine all sorts of awful things that we don't want to exist. Or, we can imagine you and me getting sick. I don't know if you've had it before, but I've had COVID, and fortunately it was fairly mild. We could imagine getting sick with a very virulent strain of COVID.
Mm.
And it's not better for that to exist in reality. As a matter of
Right.
fact, we want it not to exist in reality. So maybe we need to confine this, maybe we don't buy Anselm's premise unqualified, but we say, well,
Right.
okay, with respect to good things, it's better to exist in reality than to exist merely in the mind, or it's greater rather. So then he goes on and he says, well, okay, well, can that than which nothing greater can be thought exist only in the mind? If it does, well, then you can think of something greater than that, namely such a thing existing in reality. And so here we have a contradiction. That than which nothing greater can be thought, over here existing in the mind, is not that than which a greater can be thought, something existing in reality. Therefore, this being must, or whatever it is that this formula corresponds to, must indeed exist in not just the mind, but in reality. Whatever existing in reality actually means, existing in re,
Mm.
and so, this is like I said, this is kind of tricky. I myself sometimes find it convincing and then sometimes don't.
Mm.
I've been looking at this in a serious way, for about 25 years. And some days when I'm looking at it or I'm teaching it, I'm like, there's so much wrong with this, right? And
Right.
then in other times I'm like, if I think it through, it actually does hold up. And that's
Mm.
basically what Anselm is telling Gaunilo when Gaunilo is objecting to him. He's like, you're not actually thinking it through.
Mm.
You're bringing up all sorts of stuff that's not really relevant to this line of reasoning. Your perfect island thing, or any other thing that is not that than which nothing greater can be thought. Those things, the same argument doesn't apply to them.
Mm. Right.
And I think he is right about that. Um, there's a very interesting objection that's given by St. Thomas, who,
Mm. Well,
interestingly enough, does actually at one point say that Anselm's argument does work, that Anselm is right in the commentary on the Psalms, the commentary on the very Psalm where the fool says the fool says in his heart there is no God. Aquinas in the Summa Theologia said Deus esse, which is not exactly what Anselm is
mm.
saying,
Mm.
is not per se nota, like, on its face,
Right.
something that we would assent to. But in the commentary on the Psalms, Thomas actually says, oh, it is actually per se nota. to the wise, to those who actually understand what
Oh,
they're
that's
teaching.
right. I remember that Aquinas makes that distinction between like first principles that are known to everyone and then first principles that are known to the wise. Like everyone knows that a whole is greater than its parts, and only the wise
Yes.
know that angels don't take up space, I think is the example that he uses.
And this comes up in the Summa, that distinction, right? So for example, when he's talking about the old law and the new law, and the 10 commandments, and are these sort of like, are these the sort of things that should be immediately evident to somebody? And he's like, well, yeah, to wise people,
Right.
not to the rest of us schmucks,
Right.
and so yeah, so this is an interesting concession, you could say. Thomas
Huh.
just doesn't think that, and this is a perfectly valid objection. I think you're not actually going to get the fool to accept your first starting point, namely that God is that than which nothing greater can be thought.
Well, what I wanted to ask is how best would you characterize, if we're going to treat the Proslogian as an argument and not, a meditative text, would you characterize Anselm's argumentation as providing a sort of propter quid type argument, or I guess we could say a priori versus a sort of causal quia type argument?
Well,
Like,
if we define things that way, yes. If we accept that sort of, language and distinctions between a priori, a posteriori, and associate causal stuff with the a posteriori, yeah, then that works. That's actually more Humean than say Thomistic or
mm.
stuff like that. But
Yeah, I spoke with my advisor, Dr. Kerr, that the Blackfriars Summa, I think they translate the division as a priori and a posteriori, and it's like, no, like the language he uses is propter,
right.
quid, and quia. What are you guys doing?
Yeah. Well, the Blackfriars, this is a total digression.
Yeah, sorry.
No. I'm happy to say this because actually this is something I've been thinking about for a long time. So the Blackfriars translation is kind of uneven because they doled it out to a bunch of different people to translate it.
Mm.
And, when you see like say Anthony Kenny translating it, you're like, oh, we got to watch out for this, because there's going to be all sorts of stuff smuggled in from like contemporary British
Right.
philosophy into it. The treatise on the emotions is particularly problematic
Mm.
in that respect, where you're like, well, why in the hell did they translate this way, right?
Yeah.
And so this is actually a good point. Translations, you never have a perfect one-to-one translation, and translations are always going to be somewhat reflective of the, let's call them the background assumptions of the author. Sometimes the author will know exactly what those assumptions are, and sometimes they're just functioning almost like a lens that things are coming through. So yeah, that's a good point. I mean, and this is a sort of a broader issue of how should we classify arguments, not just in general, but about God's existence, right?
Mm.
So we have inherited this schema that we essentially got from Kant of
Yeah.
ontological, cosmological, teleological arguments, and we forget that not everyone fits in there well, and there were many other arguments that have been made in antiquity and in the Middle Ages and even in the modern period that don't neatly fit into these categories. So
All right.
for example, Descartes' argument for God's existence in Meditation 3, is it an argument from causality? Well, yeah,
Yeah.
but it's not about causality about the world because there is no world yet.
Yeah.
It's an argument about the causes of the ideas in our mind, which kind of looks, maybe it should be more of an ontological argument, but no, it's not working like an
Right.
ontological
Right.
argument. And he makes an ontological argument later, a crappy one,
Right.
in Meditation 5, right? So, I mean, some people would be tempted to say, well, Anselm first is making causal cosmological arguments in the Monologian, and then he makes this ontological
Mm.
argument in the Proslogian, and I don't think it's that cut and dried. we do want to be able to classify these in some way. Do need textbooks and 101 guides and stuff like that. But it turns out that the arguments are way more complicated and therefore more interesting when we dig into them. And I want to go back to something that you brought up. If we look at it as an argument rather than as a meditation,
Right.
I think Anselm thinks that we do best when those are the same thing. In following an argument, we often think of arguments as like linguistic constructs that we put together, with like premises and a conclusion, and there's a process of inference, and we can look at it externally. This is something that is supposed to be going on within somebody's mind or heart and orienting them thereby to a better understanding and relation to God.
All right, then. So I'm trying to wonder where to go from here, because we've kind of been going all over the place.
Well, we were going to talk about the divine attributes. And
oh yeah, that was another thing.
So
because that's another thing that people might overlook with Anselm, is that he doesn't just try to argue that God has being. It's all these other attributes that are entailed by virtue of the fact that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived.
Exactly. Yeah. And he doesn't have that working for him yet in the Monologian. There, it's more thinking in terms of, well, what does God have to be? And we can call these attributes, right? And there's nothing wrong with talking about them as attributes, just so long as we understand that they're not attributes like what you and I have. For example, you can describe me as older, like middle-aged, and you as young, right? Those are predicates. Those will change over time. I'm going to be even older later on, and you're going to eventually be old too. Or we'll both be dead
right
at a certain point, right? And we can, say other things as well, like, rational. Okay, that's part of our essence and all that. But our being is contingent being, which is different from God, and the way in which we are or exist is different than the way in which this being that we call God is. And so, he's going to talk about, well, what can we actually say? This is in chapter 15. What can or cannot be said of God substantially? Substantially is how we translate it. So relatives, supreme itself is a relative. Calling God the supreme anything, that supreme is just saying better than anything else. And if there wasn't anything else, God wouldn't be better than anything else.
Right.
So what we can actually say are these things like, so he gives like a whole list, right? He must be living, wise, powerful, all-powerful, true, just, happy, eternal, and here's the key term, whatever it is absolutely better to be than not to be. So, earlier in the Monologian, he talked about two ways in which things can be better. So you and I can be wiser, and maybe after this conversation we're a little bit further along that path, but we can always be wiser and wiser and wiser, right? And God is as wise as anything could possibly be. And as a matter of fact, God is wisdom itself, the wisdom by which, whatever is wise, and likewise living and just and stuff like that. So that's something that it's clearly better to be than not to be. What about being gold? So it's, it's great. Like, if I'm like super into, I have a coffee cup right here, that could be gold. And if I'm into, eating and drinking on gold service, well, that's nice, right? That's better than some ceramic, crappy coffee cup that came from Bed Bath and Beyond.
Sure.
And this is better than some, stone mug that I got from, I don't know, some hobo under a bridge that leaks or something like that. But if you were made of gold,
yeah.
Not as good, right? Because you wouldn't be able to talk.
Goodness seems very relative to that. When you take it in that way, like if my dog was gold, that'd be very terrible. Whereas if like a golden computer, like heck yes, I'd love to show that off at the campus. But it seems that in that goodness is something that's relative to what you're predicating it of.
some kinds of goodness are that way and other
Sure.
kinds aren't, right? So
Okay. Okay.
it's so justice, you're never going to have a case where justice would be relative in that way, where you would say, well, it's good for God to be just, but it's not good for me to be just.
Oh, right. Okay.
Now, you could say that justice doesn't apply to some things. Like, is my coffee mug just? No. And there's no sense in which, I mean, I could tell a story in which, like, this coffee mug was the product of a reward for my good deed of helping out somebody who was in a tough situation, and they gave it to me, so it's a symbol of reciprocity or something like that. But that's not the mug being just. That's just it being part of some sort of just arrangement, right? The arrangement would be just. And so God is whatever it is better to be than not to be, and he simply is what that attribute is. So, we brought up that justitia existens, existing justice. God is the superlative justice. And, in a certain way, you can put this together with the quo maius cogitari, and Anselm will do this at a couple points later on in other works. God is so just that you could not imagine a juster thing, right?
Okay.
That sounds kind of similar, doesn't it?
Mm.
And he'll talk about other similar things, like this comes up in the Cur Deus Homo, and I believe in the On Freedom of Choice, and a couple other places, these kinds of formulas that echo the quo maius cogitari non potest. And as a matter of fact, he also does that, I should mention, with some bad things, if I remember, too.
Okay.
So this formula, this logic is running throughout Anselm's mind a lot, and the idea that God can't be strictly said to be just like we are. God is that very justice, and it gets really trippy when we get away from things like justice, or being. God is the greatest being. Okay, I think we can wrap our heads around that, even though that's kind of a messy, tricky thought. But what the hell does it mean for God to be? So here's coming from the list in the end of chapter 16. What does it mean for God to be supreme life, or supreme immortality? Or, here we get even trippier, supreme eternity. God is eternal, but God is eternity itself, right?
Mm.
Or even worse, supreme unity. And then chapter 17 tells us that God is simple this is the title. God is simple in such a way that all the things that can be said of his essence are one and the same thing in him. So that means that justice actually is eternity,
Mm.
is the very unity of all of these things, which means that we don't really know what the hell we're talking about
Mm.
or
Mm.
conceptualizing when we conceptualize unity. The
Right.
unity of mundane things is not the kind of unity that God has, because
Mm.
God is so simple that even these attributes are all the same in God. Now, not necessarily in God's connection to us. So, God can be, I mean, it will be harmonized. Like, God is supremely just, but God is also merciful. How the hell did these things come together? There's a whole story that gets told in the Proslogian about how this is really, the mercy is coming from goodness, and God would, be less good if he was not merciful to at least
Right.
some people. So mercy and justice come together, and we can, as I said, I'm using this metaphor a lot, wrap our heads around that. But we have to do so through a lot of discursive thinking and complicated argumentation, which is sometimes hard to follow. And by doing so, we're actually understanding God and how God relates, whatever God is, to the rest of creation, including us miserable bastards who sin and have to be pardoned,
Right. Right.
stuff like that.
And if I may ask, I mean, it's interesting what you said, that all the divine attributes for Anselm are you might say identical in God. Like God is wisdom, God is justice, God is goodness. But
Yeah.
are they for Anselm, are they synonymous with one another? Like when we say
Well,
God
no,
is
they're not. That's a good point. So these are, and they're not even identical as such, unless we mean that there is no fundamental like distinction between them, right?
mm,
They're not identical in the way that like one plus, one and one, two units are the same thing or something
mm.
like that, right? What was the other part that you were just asking though? I think I
Well,
lost a little bit of
well,
the.
yeah, I just wanted to ask that, okay, God is justice or God is goodness. He doesn't
Hmm.
just have them as like accidental features. But we wouldn't say that when we talk about God's wisdom, we mean the exact same thing as God's
Oh,
goodness or God's being, right?
yeah. Although they are certainly not opposed to each other,
Right. We wouldn't say
and
that, but
they're not separable from each other. So in a way, the way in which, so let's take being, right,
sure.
essentia, the way in which God is as wisdom, as justice, as eternity, all those sorts of things. The way in which God is wise is by being just. These kind of like in God they imply each other,
Exactly.
you could say. Whereas in us, I
When we
mean,
talk
like
about
I
them,
can be, yeah, I mean, can I really be wise if I'm not just? Probably not, but I can have some degree of wisdom without being just. I can use, I can fail in applying it or something like that. Whereas that's not an issue for God.
right.
Um,
Interesting. Okay.
yeah, yeah. And
Well,
I mean, we could also, the whole thing about the Trinity,
oh
it,
yeah.
it's not attributes there, it's persons,
Yeah.
right? But you could think of the Trinity, and some things that you can argue to the necessity of the Trinity and explore it rationally. These are ways in which that God being what God is gets like revealed to be of a higher level. So, the Son is what the Father is, and the Son is the very thing that the Father is, and the Holy Spirit as well, right? So there's a kind of intensification within the Trinity of what justice is or what wisdom is. And, this is probably confusing to hear. And if we think about it very hard, it also gets confusing in our minds,
Yeah.
right? But that's because we're trying to cognize something that's very transcendent to us.
Right. Right. Exactly.
So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and if I could maybe go back a little bit to what you talked about with Gaunilo or Gaunilo,
Mm-hmm.
I know the pronunciation is a bit contentious. It's like half people will say Augustine, the other half will say Augustine, and they'll get pissed off with you if you say it other way. And anyway,
Yeah, and it's so ridiculous
yeah,
because who cares? I mean, I don't
exactly.
when I'm talking about Socrates, I don't say Socrates,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
Aristoteles, I mean,
yeah.
people very often, actually, this is a good lead into talking about Gaunilo,
Okay,
because
okay.
one of the things that I realized, so I've got all these YouTube videos and people make comments on them, and Gaunilo is sort of a predecessor of people who don't realize, or maybe they do realize, that they're being jerks.
Yes.
Um, because he attacks Proslogian too, right? He focuses entirely on that, gets things wrong, basically complains. And then he says, the other parts of this tract are argued so truly, so brilliantly, and so splendidly, and are also of so much worth and instinct, with so fragrant a perfume of devout and holy feeling, that in no way should they be rejected because of those things at the beginning, right?
Wow.
And so he's doing this thing that people who are, I think, insecure, I think this is why they're
Mm,
doing it. They've learned this technique of saying, "Ooh, I love your stuff. It's so amazing, so brilliant. But I've got this problem with this one thing over here that you're saying." And you're like,
yeah.
buddy, you don't need to, like, as use the old proverbial thing, blow smoke up my butt, about how great I am or something like that, or how brilliant all the rest is, if you just want to complain about this other thing. It's like when people say, with all due respect, and you're like,
Yes,
there's not going to
yes.
be
It's
any
very
respect
yeah,
here
condescending.
whatsoever.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, it's not just condescending, it's a cover your ass kind of thing, right? I think that Gaunilo is like one of the predecessors of that technique.
Maybe. Yeah, yeah.
And people who complain about, how we're pronouncing Gaunilo, or, I mean, technically speaking, it should be Anselmus, right? It shouldn't
Right.
be Anselm. If we want to be sticklers about that, they're missing the main point, and they're focusing in on stuff that I guess they find more manageable, or they think is more important. And then you see Anselm like taking Gaunilo, not to task on that, but to task on like losing the focus of what he should be actually reading.
Okay. Well, yeah. If I can maybe ask with respect to Gaunilo, famously as an interlocutor to Saint Anselm's argument, as I understand Gaunilo's objection is that we could parody Anselm's argument to fit any sort of perfective state of affairs, and the example he gives famously is the island, like a perfect island, Atlantis or whatever. And how exactly, if I remember correctly, Anselm doesn't respond to Gaunilo by name, but he does give a response.
I mean, on that particular point, I mean, he's got a whole bunch of things that he points out in relation to Gaunilo, like
Sure.
You're mixing up understanding something and thinking about something, and you're not paying attention to the language that I use. But so this is in section 6. He says, for example, they say there's in the ocean. Oh, that's Gaunilo's thing. So the reply, he says that, okay, so somebody can bring up all sorts of other things like perfect islands and all that, but you can't use the logic of that than which nothing greater can be thought with these sorts of things. It really only works for one kind of entity, namely this. And you even have to get the formula right. A greater than everything is not the same thing as that than which a greater cannot be thought. And then Anselm actually, he's got like a kind of cheeky joke in there. He's like, hey, if you can find anything else that this actually the logic really does apply to, I'll give you that perfect island, which means that Anselm thinks that you can come up with all sorts of things. Like people claim that you can like prove the existence of the devil by using the same argumentation. And what you find in every single case is that somebody has modified the language.
Right.
So they're working with something slightly different. We mentioned this earlier, like a logically perfect being is not the same thing as that than which nothing greater can be thought. Now, that than which nothing greater can be thought would in fact be a logically perfect being, but the formula is different. And there are some great philosophers, particularly in the 20th century, in the tradition in French philosophy that we call reflexive philosophy, which includes like Jacques Paliard, who wrote a whole piece on this, which I do believe is translated in a volume on Anselm. The formula can be understood as like a piece in a linguistic construct that we call an argument. It can also be understood as something like a rule. Anything that you can think of, God is greater than that.
Okay.
And so it can be understood as this kind of thing that generates a better and better and more adequate concept of God that still includes how at sea and resourceless and uncomprehending we are in relation to the divine. And you see that coming up in the later chapters of the Proslogian, right? God dwells in an inaccessible light that we can't actually see. God is greater than that which can be thought.
Right.
Out of that than which nothing greater can be thought. So, there's a tradition in reading this, which I think is a genuine interpretation, a correct interpretation of Anselm that views this. It doesn't cease being an argument or a part of an argument, but it's supposed to do more than just provide us with like a mental construct that's supposed to lead us to some object that we then call God.
Dr. Sadler, this has been great. We've covered, I don't know, a lot of ground, and we haven't really even like scratched the surface of Anselm's philosophy. Like I had originally planned that we'd also discuss his understanding of, volition and free will and rectitude and his understanding of truth. And like, if we did that, it'd be like 3-4 hour long podcast.
Yes, it was very ambitious.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm glad we shortened it down, but I think that just means that, well, I'll have to find someone else to discuss, Anselm on free will and truth, because he does have very interesting ideas, I
Yes.
think.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
But if I can maybe ask for a couple closing questions, what sort of influence did Anselm exercise, if at all, over later medieval thinkers? I mean, did people? Okay.
A lot more than people recognize unless they read widely. He is frequently brought up by Thomas Aquinas. I mean, people think about like Summa Theologia, Prima Pars, question 2, and they're like, yeah, see, Thomas didn't like Anselm, he rejected the argument. Well, I mean, read Thomas on Original Sin, and Anselm comes up all over the place. Or when Thomas is discussing truth, he's engaging Anselm's on truth, and he thinks that Anselm basically got most of the stuff right. And there's a number of other points, and that's just one person. Scotus's distinction between the two wills, I mean,
Yes.
that's coming out of Anselm's distinction. Interestingly, though, one of the texts where Anselm actually had the most influence was this thing that wound up being called the De Similitudinibus, meaning on likenesses. It's untranslated. It's in the Memorials of St. Anselm.
Oh.
Actually, a truncated version of it. Smith or Southern and Schmidt did the same sort of thing where they pared it down to what they think is genuinely Anselmian and not just like from the Dicta Anselmi. And that was about the monastic life. And that text like circulated like crazy, as did his prayers and meditations. So Anselm exercised a pretty significant influence in a lot of ways that in philosophy we don't really register, because we've got this mistaken viewpoint on what the history of ideas was like, where there's philosophy over here and then there's other disciplines, when really, a lot of people in the medieval period were polymaths. They studied different disciplines. They were supposed to be integrated with each other. As I mentioned, Anselm's prayers and meditations very popular as well. His letters as a collection were circulating around, as well as were all these other texts that had important effects. And so he is quite influential. But he's not part of a school, you could say.
Right.
I mean, he's a Benedictine, but what does that mean? There's lots of Benedictines.
We can talk about him being an Augustine, but Augustine doesn't determine Augustine's own application. Like, there are so many different Augustinians, as you said.
Exactly. Right? Yeah.
All right.
So, I mean, he's been kind of undervalued, you could say, really since the end of the Middle Ages onward. But he's well worth digging into and spending a lot of time with. I mean, I never thought I would be doing that, but I happened to run across some of his interesting points of view at the right time, and then get some real mentoring and fostering by essentially Benedictine monks who also happen to be scholars, and like they were like, yeah, you should keep reading this guy, check it out,
So. Well, yeah. I think that's very common. Like when I'm in the Dominican House of Studies, it's all about Aquinas.
Yep. Yeah, right. He's their guy.
Yeah. Which makes sense. I mean, all right. I guess as maybe a concluding question, I can ask, do you have any book recommendations or recommended translations for those who'd want to learn more about Anselm of Canterbury? Yeah,
I mean, Thomas Williams' translations are close to the text and, reliable. I mean, if you can read Anselm in Latin, it's always good to go to the original text. But Williams has done a lot of great service in providing better translations that are basically like the standard these days. There's a lot of great Anselm scholarship out there. Unfortunately, quite a bit of it hasn't been translated from French or German or Italian. For For those who can actually read French, there's a classic study by Dom Pouchet. I'm blanking on the name of it right now, but it's really quite good. I mentioned Kate Rogers
Right.
earlier. Her stuff I'm a big fan of. And there's there's a lot out there. As a matter of fact, one place that people should maybe check out is the Institute for St. Anselm Studies at St. Anselm College, where they have like an entire reading room full of materials on Anselm. And they, for graduate students, they actually offer summer fellowships to go study there.
Hmm.
And they have some stuff that's online that can be useful. They also put on a metaphysics colloquium every year,
Nice.
which is worth going to. So yeah. And then there have been some recent edited volumes coming out of St. Anselm conferences that are quite fun to read around in and see what the state of the art for Anselm scholarship is. I
Nice.
did mention Eileen Sweeney, who's at Boston College, who has written a number of articles on Anselm, as well as a book on Anselm about Anselm and prayer. And I'm also blanking on the name of that, unfortunately, but easy
No,
enough to
it's
look
fine.
up, I think.
That's fine.
So yeah.
And then, of course, there are your videos on Anselm of Canterbury that I think are very, very helpful and accessible. If I can dare, if I dare say.
Yeah, I'm glad to read that. Yeah, nobody else is really doing that sort of work, unfortunately. I'd like to see some of the people out there in Anselm scholarship doing that, but I think a lot of them are reticent to get on camera.
Hmm.
And I do have some, I have a few writings of my own on Anselm, mostly articles that I've published here and there that might be interesting or helpful for people.
All right. Well, Dr. Sadler, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me on.